Okay, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think we've got almost 100 people here, so that's a fantastic shout out for Temperate Rainforest. I'm Julie Stoneman. I'm Saving Scotland's Rainforest Project Manager, work up in Scotland, and with me today is Dave Lammercraft, who is Plantlife's lichens and bryophytes specialist for England and Wales. And today, together, we'll be taking you for a bit of a tour around temperate rainforest. Dave's going to start with giving you some context about what temperate rainforest is, looking at it in a global context before coming into the UK. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happening here in Scotland, and then handing back to Dave, who'll tell you a bit about what's going on in England and Wales, and then we'll wrap up at the end and then have some questions. We're joined as well by Erin Schott, who is the Communications and Policy Officer for Plantlife Scotland, and she's going to be keeping an eye on the chat and on the questions, keeping an eye on the technical things, and joining us at the end to quiz Dave and I with any of your questions that you've posed. So just before we begin, just a little housekeeping. Hopefully there won't be any technical hitches, but here we are online as ever. So who knows what might happen. If we lose the session, we will try our best to get it back. So please do hang on. If you lose the connection yourself, then the best thing to do is just log out and then log back in using the same link. So hopefully you'll get back that way. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. That would be super. But if you've got chat and you want to share information or chat with each other, please use the chat. Some people don't like the chat so much. Don't worry about that. You can go into full screen, just choose view full screen, and you can just move it to the side and ignore it and just listen to us talk instead. We will be recording this, so if you want to watch it again, then it will be available on the YouTube channel afterwards, and you can share it with your friends as well. So if that's enough of an introduction, let's get started. And I'm going to start by handing over to Dave to give us an introduction.
Okay. Hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm Dave. So I've been working on rainforests now for Plantlife for, I don't know, 10 years pretty much since I first started working for Plantlife. And before that, when I was working for RSPB, we did bits of work on rainforests too. So it's a habitat that it's actually really close to my heart. It's a habitat I know fairly well, and it's really nice to be able to stand here today and talk to you about it. So I'm going to kind of do a bit of background stuff about what makes rainforest and why it's important and why we need to care about it. So to start with, we'll look at some climate maps. So this is the annual average temperature globally. As we all know, it's pretty hot around the tropics and gets cooler towards the poles and north and south. The band to look at on this map is the yellow one that goes across Central North America and through Central Europe, Central Asia. And then again on a similar latitude south of the equator in Southern South America, Tasmania, Southern Australia and New Zealand. And then just keep the yellow bits in mind from the last map. Looking at the rainfall, again, we know that the tropics are wet. We have the tropical rainforest through South America and Central Africa and Southeast Asia. But if you look up in the Pacific Northwest, up along the western Canadian coast, it's pretty wet up there. Again, down in Southern South America, Southern Chile, very wet. I mean, similar levels of rainfall to you get in the tropical forests. And in the Western Europe, coastal fringe, Southern Norway and Western Britain, Iberian Peninsula, pretty wet again, and again down in New Zealand, Japan and the Korean Peninsula, all pretty wet, but they're wet within that kind of temperate climate zone, so where that yellow band of temperature was. So basically we get the temperate rainforest where woodland and forest intersects with that particular those set of particular climatic conditions, which is, it's pretty wet, so up around 1.5 meters of rain a year or more. It's pretty cool. We don't get particularly hot summers, and the summers are wet with a decent amount of rainfall, basically a decent proportion of our annual rainfall in the summer months. And generally, there's not a lot of difference in the climate between summer and winter, so it's quite a kind of equable climate. So this kind of intersection of that forest and woodland habitat with this particular climatic condition is actually quite scarce around the globe. You can kind of see it on this map here, the green areas. So it's really quite a small area of the world's land surface. Less than 1% of the global land surface is covered by temperate rainforest. And this contrasts to about 7% of tropical forest. And 15% of the temperate rainforest resources in Europe, with about 6% of that in Britain and Ireland. This photo here is from the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. And it always amazes me when you see photos and footage of the Pacific Northwest rainforests, how similar it looks to a lot of our conifer plantations in Western Britain. And of course, this is partly because a lot of our conifer species grown commercially are from areas of rainforest elsewhere in the world, like the Pacific Northwest. But they still have these kind of moss-covered boulders and lots of ferns and this kind of general luxuriance of vegetation that we're used to seeing in Britain. So focusing in a bit more now on Britain. So the map on the left here, this is from some work that Dr. Chris Ellis at Edinburgh Botanic Gardens did a few years ago. For some reason, I don't know why, but it seems to omit Northern Ireland from Great Britain, so apologies for that. But the map on the left is basically a climatic map of oceanicity, so basically how warm and wet the climate is. The warmer and wetter it is, the darker the blue colour. And the map on the right is the kind of indicative area of where rainforest is in Britain. You can see how much those two things coincide. So our rainforest is basically the woodland and forests where it's warm and wet. And this is kind of classic image really of our British rainforest. This is down at Wistman's Wood on Dartmoor. But it's a fairly typical scene in a British rainforest. So it doesn't look that dissimilar in North Wales or the Lake Districts or Western Scotland. You just get slightly different species, but you get these moss covered boulders. You get these kind of fairly twisted, stunted little oak trees, draped in lichens and covered in bryophytes, and generally pretty wet or foggy as it is here or was here on that day. So looking at some of the species that we get in the rainforest, you might think that the rainforest is kind of defined by the oak trees. But if you look at the distribution of sessile oak, which sessile oak is probably the commonest rainforest tree in Britain, that's actually found all across Central Europe. So it's not, strictly speaking, a rainforest species at all. And looking at some of the birds, so on a British level, the rainforest in Britain is really, really important for things like wood warblers, redstarts, pie flycatchers, and tree pipits. But again, they're not strictly speaking rainforest species. You can see this map of wood warbler here. They're found across Central and Northern Europe, so not tied to the rainforest, but it's a slightly different story when you start to look at the bryophytes and the lichens and the ferns. So this is prickly featherwort, which is a little liverwort. Plagiochyla spinulosa is its scientific name. And that's pretty well restricted to rainforest zones throughout the world. So Western Britain, Southern Norway, the Atlantic Islands, Pacific Northwest, New Zealand. There's a few outliers here and there, but that probably relates to altitudinal climatic differences. Norwegian specklebelly, a really lovely, quite big, chunky lichen that's quite abundant in Scottish rainforest, but quite rare further south. This is a real rainforest species. This is only found in temperate rainforest. As you can see from the map here, Southern Norway, Western Britain, the Atlantic Islands, and Southern Chile. And Wilson's filmy fern, one of our smallest little ferns. Again, a very similar distribution to the Norwegian specklebelly lichen, but only found in Europe. So really, it's kind of, in a way, it's these lichens, bryophytes, and ferns that really define the rainforest habitat, the temperate rainforest habitat. It's not the same, the rainforest isn't the same in Devon as it is in Argyll, it's quite different. And just looking at some of these species, so top left here is the tree lungwort, Nabaria pulmonaria. You see from the map there, it's actually found through most of our rainforest zones. It's quite widespread. It's definitely more common up in Argyll compared to Devon, but it's found throughout the zone. And the little lichen to the top right, that's called octopus suckers. It's a type of jelly lichen, and this is really confined to wettest parts of our rainforest. So it's not really anywhere outside of Western Scotland and parts of Southwest Ireland, as you see from the map there. And I think that's partly due to the fact that these jelly lichens, they only start to photosynthesize when the body of the lichen is saturated. So they really need this high level of water, high level of rainfall, whereas the species in the photo on the bottom of the slide here, which is called Basidia biotyrrhina, it doesn't have a common name. This is a crustose species that grows kind of immersed in the bark of the trees. This can photosynthesize just using water vapor, so that can grow in much drier conditions. So it's much more of a southern species in British rainforests. So our rainforests are quite different even within in Great Britain. So all this kind of adds up really to this amazing diversity and richness of ferns and lichens, mosses and liverworts in our rainforests. I mean, some sites are well, the whole of Britain is incredibly rich, but some sites in particular, you can have hundreds of species of lichens and mosses, liverworts and ferns on a single site. And I go as far to argue that they're kind of our lions of the Masai Mara. They're part of our natural heritage that we really need to be proud of, really need to shout about, and really need to protect. It's not just actually about, to me anyway, it's not just about the rare species and the kind of conservation interest of these sites, but the rainforest is beautiful. You know, it's an amazing place to go wandering. And I love this quote here from John Muir, that the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. But I've been inclined to just amend John Muir's quote and add in rainforest in front of there. Okay, so I think I'm handing back to Julie now, hopefully.
Hi, great. Thank you, Dave. So as you've probably worked out from Dave's presentation, temperate rainforest is a really important habitat, very special, full of these amazing small plants, the lichens, the bryophytes, and so on. So this habitat is a priority for Plantlife because of the rarity and the diversity of these species. We really want to look after them. So we are putting our efforts there, and it's one of our highest priority habitats for the organisation. But the question that this webinar is answering today is, well, you know, what's Plantlife doing about it and how are we working together? So Plantlife's actually been working on temperate rainforest for decades. Much of the work it's been doing is quite behind the scenes. You might not have heard of it, but it started out with mapping out the most important areas. We call these important plant areas, or IPAs. They've been mapped out in many parts of the world, including in the British Isles. Temperate rainforest is one of our important plant areas. So our work is really about working with organisations and communities on the ground to restore and expand rainforest habitat. And we work in many different ways. We can't tell you everything we've been doing today because we've only got an hour and it'll take a bit longer than that. But what Dave and I will do is give you a bit of a flavour of what we're doing. So I'm going to start by talking through Saving Scotland's Rainforest Project. So Dave, if you could just click once, that should come up. Yep, so we're working beautifully together here. So this is a very ambitious project which covers an entire zone. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, because that's my job to work on that one. Then Dave's going to talk a bit specifically about the work he's been involved with across England and Wales. And he's been working with many different partners in different ways. One of the projects he'll specifically talk about is this one in the southwest called Building Resilience in Southwest Woodlands. So this is just coming to an end now, actually, but it's been a great project which has built loads of interest in temperate rainforest down in the southwest through outreach work with children and adults, with landowners and others. So that's built a lot of momentum in that area, which we hope to keep building on in the years ahead. But Dave will tell you a bit more about that. The other one's this interesting thing called LOST project. So that stands for looking out for the small things, and the small things are those bryophytes and lichens, those small plants. This finished a couple of years ago, and again was a lot about raising awareness of temperate rainforest in Cumbria, working with landowners, working with local communities, and it's left a legacy of people who have got together in groups to look after the rainforest and monitor the habitat. So that's a great legacy that's been left. Just finally, one more click, Dave. there's the secrets of the Celtic rainforest. So I can see there's quite a few people from Scotland here today. I don't know if you remember this project. This ended quite a long time before I started with Plantlife, but again was all about increasing awareness of the rainforest and engaging land managers and local communities in it. So we'd never call it Celtic rainforest now for reasons I will explain in a sec. But the Saving Scotland's Rainforest, which is much more of a bigger partnership project, is built on the top of that. So next slide, I'm going to start with Saving Scotland's Rainforest. My role and my job is quite different from what Dave does. So Dave is a lichens and bryophyte expert, and he gives advice to people interested in looking after temperate rainforests in different places, and he'll talk all about that in a second. Mine is much more about working across the entire zone, working with lots of different partners who are all interested in this habitat. So my sorts of skills are much more about partnership building and facilitation and project management and that kind of thing. I don't tend to work on particular projects on the ground. So they're two quite contrasting ways of work that you'll see. So Saving Scotland's Rainforest is the project. We call it that. That's the project. It's this rare, internationally important habitat down the west coast. This is a big part of Scotland, all the way from North Sutherland down to South Argyll. That's about 21% of Scotland. Now, if you're really sharp-eyed, you'll notice that this map here is a slightly smaller boundary than the map that was on the previous page for the zone in Scotland, and that's because the partnership that I'm working with is focusing on what we call the hyper oceanic zone, and that means it's really, really wet, wetter than anywhere else. But this is where the most important part of ancient woodland is, and therefore that's where the most important areas of rainforest are, and that's where we want to focus our efforts. That's why that zone is slightly smaller. Though myself and the rest of us who live in Scotland on this Zoom call can be very proud that we have the highest quantity and quality of all that rainforest in Europe right here in Scotland, because of the quantity, diversity and rarity of lichens and bryophytes that Dave was talking about. But this is in real trouble. Firstly, there's only 30,000 hectares left. That's an area just a bit bigger than Edinburgh, and that's scattered in small fragments along this zone in blue there. And those fragments are faced by very large-scale threats. So the big ones are high deer numbers, which prevent regeneration, and therefore, without regeneration, these woodlands will die after a while. And rhododendron, this is a non-native invasive species, very pretty bush with lovely pink flowers, which loves the rainforest, loves the climate, and chokes these woodlands, chokes out those very important plants there, prevents access, and is incredibly difficult to get rid of. So they're big ones. There's lots of other threats as well. So a fifth of the rainforest in Scotland was planted over with conifers in the 70s and 80s. There's climate change is an issue. Tree diseases like ash dieback is an issue. Nitrogen is an issue in places. So these are big, large-scale threats that's there. And on top of all that, not many people even know we have a rainforest. I'm pleased to say that's starting to change. But still, if you go to the average person in a pub in Scotland, they won't know what you're talking about when you talk about temperate rainforest in Scotland. So I often say it's no walk in the park to save Scotland's rainforest, but we are on it. So next slide. I hope Dave's going to go for the next slide. Oh, back one. Oh, is there a slide missing? Oh, that's odd.
Sorry, that's kind of what's happening.
Oh, sorry. Okay, all right. There's a slide missing, so I'll just talk through that, but don't worry. So if you want to save Scotland's rainforest, you really can't do it alone. And so in 2017, the Woodland Trust initiated an alliance called the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest. And they scouted around for other organisations who would like to join them in helping to save Scotland's rainforest. And there were a number of different organisations. So Plantlife was, of course, one of the first to put its hand up because it's one of our important plant areas. We're very interested in it. and other NGOs like National Trust for Scotland, Trees for Life, Scottish Wildlife Trust. Lots of different kinds of NGOs joined up, but we also got statutory agencies, the government agencies like Forestry and Land Scotland, Scottish Forestry, Nature Scot. There's specialist societies like the British Lichen Society, British Biological Society, and there's a few others. So now there's 23 different organisations who are all joined together and have the same objective, that they want to save Scotland's rainforest together. So Woodland Trust in 2019 then signed a memorandum of understanding with Plantlife, and the memorandum of understanding was for those two organisations to drive this partnership forward together. So it's Woodland Trust and Plantlife that will do everything they can to make this happen, working alongside all those different organisations. So it's quite an amazing group of organisations to work with, and I do feel very privileged in this job because the people who represent those organisations are all very passionate about the rainforest and want to do something about it. So there's a lot of energy and passion around it. So the first 2 years of the Alliance's life was spent producing this report on the left called The State of Scotland's Rainforest. So this is a research report. You can download it from the Woodland Trust website if you really want to learn more about the rainforest. But this was very significant because it's the first time anybody had really laid the case about rainforest in Scotland on the table. So the figures were crunched for the first time to show just how much rainforest there is, what the threats were, how much it's threatened, what we need to do about it. And that was launched with great fanfare a couple of years ago in the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and with some PR. So that's the first time people really started to talk about rainforest. Alongside that was a kind of sister document called the Strategy to Save Scotland's Rainforest. And I sometimes laughingly call this the encyclopedia of everything you can think of to save the rainforest. It's very broad and very long term, but it's a very useful document. And then when I started working as the Saving Scotland's Rainforest project manager, I was given these documents and said, this is time to deliver on the strategy. We kind of know what we want to do, time to deliver. However, of course, we can't do everything. So we had to work out, where are we going to put our collaborative efforts in the shorter term? So next slide, please. And hopefully the right one will come up this time. Yes, great. So these are the 4 areas that are our sort of shorter term, over sort of 3-year period, areas of collaboration. So there's lots of different work going on in the rainforest zone, done by lots of different organisations, but these are the ones that we work on together. So we want to establish landscape scale projects to restore and expand rainforest sites. We want to identify how the Scottish Government can give greater priority to restoring Scotland's rainforest. And that's written very, very carefully, you may notice, because we have the statutory agencies in the Alliance and they can't advocate to themselves. So we work as an alliance to work out what the policies are we want to influence in the Scottish Government, and it's up to the charities to go off and try and influence the Scottish Government. We can't do it as the Alliance. So these are the areas we've been focusing on earlier on, and now we're really getting on to the other 2, which is about encouraging and enabling landowners and managers to restore and expand rainforest in their areas, and of course maximising our own collaboration to improve our understanding of rainforest so we can best manage it. Next slide. So we had to get over that tricky hurdle that nobody knew about the rainforest. And when I started, it was amazing how we were calling this habitat by many different names. So when I started, it was regularly called Western Atlantic Woodland, Atlantic Woodland, Atlantic Rainforest, Celtic Rainforest, and Scotland's Rainforest. So no wonder nobody had heard of it, because nobody really knew what we were talking about. We were speaking in many different tongues. So we got the communications guys together and we had a think about how we could get the profile of this habitat better known. And the first thing that came to light was, well, we're going to have to call it one thing. So let's call it Scotland's Rainforest. So in Scotland, we try amongst all these organisations to call it Scotland's Rainforest if we're talking in a Scottish context, and we call it temperate rainforest if we're talking in a more general context. And that's worked incredibly well. So I've just put some examples of websites or promotional material that the different organisations have put out. And again, it's all speaking with one voice, and that has been incredibly powerful. So together, these 23 organisations are pushing out very clear, consistent, targeted messages all through the year to those that can make a difference. And we try and get a couple of what we call comms moments a year to really shine a spotlight on the habitat. So that's gone really well, and that was launched, that strategy was launched just last year, and now I'd say our target audiences know what we're saying when we're talking about Scotland's rainforest. Next slide, please. One of the most important audiences for us is the political audience, and the reason for that is because they've really got the purse strings to make this happen. But it was fast, our influence of this audience, and within a few months we were very, very lucky that we landed on a year where there were Scottish elections. So within a few months we had manifesto commitments in 3 of the major party manifestos. Now this is just an amazing step forward. We were so pleased that we got through. Then this document on the bottom left is the programme for government for the Scottish Government, and it's in there. And then here's Mary McCallum, who's the Scotland's Environment Minister, repeating the same commitment at the COP26, that big international climate conference in Glasgow last November. Scotland's rainforest will be restored and expanded as a natural solution to the climate emergency. This is fantastic stuff. We've got political commitment. Now we need to get action on the ground. Thank you. Next slide. So what is it we want? So we started saying we want these landscape scale projects. You saw it in the objectives. So the Alliance is a voluntary partnership. It's not constituted. It can't lead projects for its own. It can't fundraise on its own. It relies on the partners. So, but there are partners leading landscape scale projects in that zone. We've got Woodland Trust Scotland, RSPB and Argyll Coast and Community Trust. So these 4 projects all conform to a number of criteria that are agreed by the Alliance, and so they've been adopted by the Alliance. So the idea is that we work together to fundraise for these projects, to make them, to pool all our skills and expertise and work together to try and get funding, and most important of all, avoid competition. Of course, we're competing with each other. There aren't many pots of money out there to apply for, but the idea is we talk to each other and we make sure that if we're putting in applications, we're presenting the case as a bigger picture, not just Glen Torridon, but Glen Torridon is contributing to saving Scotland's rainforest. So those funders can see we're all talking about the same thing. It has been an amazingly difficult environment to raise money in, and I admit we have struggled. So for Morven and Argyll, we've managed to kick it off, but we haven't managed to get the sort of multi-million, multi-year funding that you need to really do landscape scale restoration that's needed in these areas. However, with that political commitment behind us, we have not been deterred. In fact, we've upped our game completely. So next slide, please. So now we're calling for a rainforest restoration fund. So those of you who are familiar with the environmental world in Scotland might remember there's a peatland action fund, and that's a government fund of 250 million, which is there to restore peatland habitat. A lot of that's about carbon sequestration and so on. So what we're saying is, if you want to really save Scotland's rainforest, if you really want to fulfill the commitment you've made, you need to invest. And we think, we've totted it up, and we think it costs about £500 million to save Scotland's rainforest. So we think if the Scottish Government could put down half of that, then we could raise the rest from private sources. So that's the ask we're putting in. And that's an amazingly bolshy ask. I would never have thought we could do that a year ago. But with that sort of political interest, this is the sort of thing we could do. So we're saying we're not talking just about a few projects. We're talking about ecosystem restoration over a decade with proper funding, a development phase with proper community-centric projects with geographic targeting. Thank you. Next slide. So that's the sort of stuff we're doing at the moment, and we are in active discussions about this. Who knows if it will come off? I don't know. I can't predict that, but we will know within 2 or 3 months whether we've gone anywhere towards getting some sort of rainforest restoration fund like that. So just to finish off, a little bit about what's happening, kicking off this year. In the middle of this picture here is Dr. Oliver Moore. He was recruited by Plantlife last year, and he's a lichens and bryophyte specialist like Dave, so we don't have to call on Dave all the time now. We've got our own lichens and bryophyte specialist in Scotland. And his job will be to work across the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest to get management and monitoring standards together. And that sets the bar for how we should be managing and monitoring rainforest in Scotland. And once he's managed to develop those, he'll be promoting them, not just between the different Alliance partners, but beyond them as well. And this will really help us to raise the profile of this habitat with landowners and managers across that zone. Next slide. This is a really exciting project and shows you don't have to stick within your zone. So this is a project about upland deer management in Scotland. Anybody who knows about deer in Scotland will know there's quite a big policy shift about to happen because the idea that high deer numbers so the idea that high deer numbers aren't in the public interest is starting to gain weight. And the Scottish Government is looking at how to reduce deer numbers in Scotland to make way for regeneration of habitats and allowing carbon sequestration and biodiversity improvements. So there are a lot of different opinions on this around, and for decades there's been massive conflict between many of the people involved in upland deer management. So some of the partners of the Alliance are working together with people outside the Alliance, including the Association of Deer Management Groups and Cairngorms National Park. And we've put together a project to look at civic mediation to try and unblock some of the conflict between some of the players involved. And I'm pleased to say that we have almost reached our target for our funding proposal for that. So we hopefully will be able to kick that off later this year and look at the relationships between people alongside work from the Scottish Government to put new policies in place on deer management in Scotland. So that's quite a different kind of project, quite an exciting one, a very innovative one. Nobody's tried that before on deer management. Next slide. So this is my last slide, and it's quite an intriguing one, but it just shows there's lots of opportunities when you work in alliances. So last November, when there was that big climate COP gathering in Glasgow, Rally International had actually joined the Alliance not long before that, and they were kicking off a new programme in Scotland's rainforest for volunteer work to train up new environmental leaders, young environmental leaders in the rainforest. And a group representing Indigenous leaders, Indigenous peoples, found out about this and said, well, we're bringing some Indigenous leaders from Brazil to the Glasgow Climate Conference for them to give them a platform to talk about Indigenous people's rights in nature and their role in nature. And we'd really like to bring them over to Scotland's rainforest to perform a blessing ceremony and get some more PR. What do you think? So we said, well, yes, absolutely. So we had an amazing event where these Indigenous leaders came and blessed our own rainforest. It's very emotional, amazing event. And we managed to raise some money to get a film to film it. And that film is now being edited. So we'll be launching that later on this year. And again, that gives us another opportunity to shine a spotlight on Scotland's rainforest with quite a unique angle about it. So lots of exciting things happening up here. Okay, I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand back to Dave, who's going to give you a bit more on the ground perspective of management of the rainforest in England and Wales.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so as Julie mentioned at the beginning, really, our kind of work in Wales and England really has been a bit different to what Julie's been up to in Scotland. It's been a bit more focused on doing stuff on the ground, I guess, at this stage, and not so much on getting that kind of political leverage and all that amazing work you just heard Julie talking about. The map on the right here are kind of main areas in which we've been working in Wales. So the woods up around Snowdon in the top there, and then in Meirionydd here, so around Porthmadog and Dolgellau, Barmouth and Harlech, and then down in the Cambrian Mountains around the Annan Valley and near Llanwrtyd Wells. And yeah, as I say, a lot of it's been focused on habitat management work, and this is one of the first pieces of work I did for Plantlife back in 2012, working with the National Trust. And some surveys have highlighted an issue around kind of increasing shade, leading to some of the lichens, some of the interesting lichens declining on the site. So we did some kind of light thinning work in the picture on the right here, just to create more gladed, better lit conditions, because a lot of these lichens need quite a lot of light. Many of them are kind of glade and sort of woodland edge species rather than deep forest species. So they need those light levels. So we just kind of created some fairly big glades in around that wood. And nearby, the picture on the left, it's about 100 meters or so away from the picture on the right. So this was an open field back in the late 1990s. And the National Trust planted that up with ash at the time and a small amount of willow. And amazingly, that's been colonized amazingly well by the lungwort lichens and things like the stinky sticktors, and a lot of these rainforest species have colonized onto these young trees really quickly. So we did another kind of restructuring project in there where we opened it up quite a bit and created some glades and just made the conditions a bit more suitable for these lichens as they were colonizing. So all that kind of restructuring work is all very well, but unless you have grazing in place, you end up needing to go back and kind of do more restructuring work in the future. So in terms of long-term management of rainforest habitats, getting the grazing and the browsing right is kind of key, and there can be issues with that, like Julie mentioned, deer and goats, and so these kind of feral animals can be a problem sometimes, but ultimately managing that grazing and browsing is key to that kind of long-term condition of the woods. So with funding from the Ashley Family Foundation, we were able to fund the introduction of some Highland cows into this bit of woodland, the same block of woodland as in the previous couple of slides. And these Highland cows, there are only 3 of them in quite a big block of wood. They did an amazing job of keeping on top of the bramble and just keeping on top of dense regeneration, and the woodland floor is much more open and much more suitable for the bryophytes and also for things like bluebells and wood anemones. And you can see in the foreground of the photo, there's still young trees popping up, so the wood's still regenerating. We've also done a bit of outreach work, engagement work, so running training courses. This is a course run for woodland managers from the RSPB, from National Trust, Natural Resources Wales, and the Wildlife Trusts with the bryologist Des Callahan, where we learned about oceanic bryophytes, their ecology and identification. We produced things like these ID guides, which some of you will have seen, no doubt, incredibly popular. They never last long when we do a print run of those. But the idea behind that was to support these kind of training programs, but also just to get people interested and out there looking at the woods and the lichens and bryophytes. We've also put a lot of effort into supporting the development of the Celtic Rainforests Life project, which is about partway through now. It's one of the biggest life-funded projects that there's been in Europe, multi-million pounds running over, I think it's 8 or 9 years of project, something like that. And the main thrust of this really is around dealing with the rhododendron issue in 2 big areas of, well, 3 or 4 big areas of rainforest in Wales. And the issue around rhododendron, Julie mentioned it earlier on, but the issue is quite well illustrated by this photo at top right here. So that wall running up the hill there divides an RSPB reserve on the right-hand side from a Welsh Government forest estate on the left-hand side. And RSPB have been controlling rhododendron on their bit for decades, but the rhododendron on the left-hand side of the wall hasn't been controlled at all. So RSPB are locked into this kind of constant cycle of having to check and control any rhododendron that crosses the border, basically. So if you think that a rhododendron bush will cast millions of seeds each time it flowers, and they're wind dispersed, there's a constant rain of seed across the wall there. So the guiding principle behind the project, the Celtic Rainforest project, is to take this landscape scale approach to the control of rhododendron. So we're removing it from this kind of buffer, quite a big buffer area around all these important sites. You see the map on the top left there. The aim is to kind of control it, remove it essentially from that whole catchment there. We've done the odd little bit of lichen rescuing. So this is an amazing old oak tree, ash tree that blew down in a summer gale a couple of years ago. And we took some of the material off that and transplanted it lower down into the wood. this is a part of the wood that was full of rhododendron in the late 1990s, and that had quite an impact on the lichen interest there. So we're kind of bolstering up the kind of lichen populations by taking it from that big old ash tree that came down and transplanting it into the lower part of the wood. And we're even dabbling in little bits of research. I'm no scientist, sorry for saying that slightly with my tongue in my cheek, but this is work funded by Natural Resources Wales. The lichen in the middle there is blackberries in custard. You need a bit of imagination to see blackberries or custard really in that. It doesn't look particularly appetizing. This is a really rare species. It's only known in one site in Wales, one site in England, a handful of sites in Scotland and Western Ireland, and in the Atlantic Islands, so globally really rare. It's a specialist of really humid ravines on smooth bark, especially of hazel. And on this site here in North Wales, there's owned by the Woodland Trust. There's sort of hazel's hemmed in by this ring of conifers, and the plan was to take down these conifers. We wanted to make sure that that actually was going to do the right things for the lichens. So we've got this monitoring in place where we're looking at the humidity and looking at the impacts on the humidity of removing those conifers, and looking at the impacts on the lichen, the theory being that it will increase and spread. We're a relatively small organisation as it stands, and we don't own any rainforests, so we're really dependent on working with partners, and been working with all these partners here in Wales to deliver a lot of this work. And we'll move over into England now. So in England, we've had, as Julie mentioned earlier, we've had 3 big projects now in the last few years, all funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. One of which was the Lost project, looking at the small things up in the Lake District. It's working with these partners here. And this was really about kind of getting people out into the rainforest, out there looking at lichens and bryophytes, appreciating them, learning about them. We had lots of events with schools and with community groups, getting people out and about. We had this amazing photography competition, which led to a big exhibition. You see the photos on the top right there, which toured around various venues in the Lake District, and we had thousands of people come along to that photo exhibition. We also ran a land manager training program as part of that, where woodland managers could come along and learn about lichens and bryophytes and management for them. And a big part of it was what we called new generation botanists. So this was like a training scheme for people that wanted to learn more about lichens and bryophytes. And so that this is kind of like an expert-led training program where we had 2 groups, one on lichens, one on bryophytes. And they became the Cumbria Lichen and Bryophyte group. So that's an independent group now, aside from Plantlife. And they're an amazing bunch, really knowledgeable, really friendly. And if you're in the Cumbria area and want to get out and about looking at lichens and bryophytes, then it's definitely worth checking them out. You can find them on Facebook. Then down in the southwest, we had a project called Make the Small Things Count. Again, lottery funded. That was running a few years ago, and that ended, and then we replaced that with another project, or followed that on with another project called Building Resilience in the Southwest Woodlands. Again, lottery funded, working with the partners listed there. And again, this had a really big kind of working with people and communities angle to it. And we had this project around a rapid woodland assessment. So this is a way to go and look at a woodland and try and work out whether it's likely to be good for bryophytes and lichens, and what any issues might be. Is there rhododendron there? Is there holly invasion? All that kind of stuff. And we had about 170 participants in this project, with over 200 surveys submitted around Dartmoor and Exmoor. So this is giving us a really good picture of the kind of condition of the woods in that kind of landscape. And again, we had a new generation botanist scheme. So we had 2 on lichens and 2 on bryophytes as part of this project. And we had a training program for land managers, woodland owners, woodland managers and woodland advisors, which we ran last year. last autumn. So it's getting people out and about, sort of looking at management that's been done through the project, giving them a chance to talk to other woodland owners and other woodland managers about managing the rainforests. And we did some small, fairly small scale habitat management projects up in Exmoor, at Watersmeet, Horcombe, Hornerwood, Tar Steps and Hawkridge Ridge. It's working with National Trust and Exmoor National Park and Natural England. The photo on the right here is a pollarding project that we did at Horcombe. So this is a little area with some amazing old oak pollards where we did some work to protect those pollards, but also to repollard some young ones, young trees. So we've got that future generation of pollards to come on. And then down in Dartmoor, we worked with Natural England and Woodland Trust in the Bovey Valley to create corridors of lichen appropriate habitat, lichen bryophyte suitable habitat through the woodlands, using these ancient wood banks as the kind of boundary features and opening up those to make them more light and better lit. Ash dieback, so Julie mentioned this earlier, a major issue for lichens and the major issue for the rainforest. We've been doing quite a bit of work funded by Natural England, looking at the impact of that on lichens, and importantly what woodland managers can do about managing their sites to try and limit those impacts on the lichens. And we've recently published some guidance, it's on the website, about how site managers can go about managing their sites to try and limit the impacts of the disease on the lichens, as well as doing quite detailed site-based advisory work with people like the National Trust. I'm doing a talk on this next week as part of the Spring Into Action programme, so if anyone wants to come along, you'd be more than welcome. And that's me. I need to hand back to Julie now.
Hi, thanks, Dave. Good. So I think you've got a bit of an impression about what we're doing around the country in very different ways, but all very brilliant work to raise the profile of temperate rainforest and get action on the ground to restore it and expand it. So you may, having seen all this, you might be quite interested in doing things yourself. We'd really encourage you to get out and explore and find some rainforest for yourself. Erin's going to put a link up for a map on the Alliance of Scotland's Rainforest website, and that's got lots of different ideas. We don't have quite the same map for England and Wales yet, but again, Erin's going to put some ideas up of places that you can look up on Google and explore. If you want to find out more about rainforests, we have just launched a new webpage called a Rainforest Hub, and on there's all sorts of different resources you can use to learn about the rainforest. So there's identification guides, there's self-taught courses on mosses and liverworts and ferns and lichens, and there's things like a rainforest management toolkit for land managers, there's case studies, and there's the rapid woodland assessment that Dave referred to earlier as well. So this has all just been launched and there'll be more added to it in the coming weeks, so do have a look at that. You may want to go to the specialist societies like British Biological Society, British Lichen Society, and I hope I pronounced this right, British Pteridological Society, which I think is all about ferns, and they have their own resources on websites as well. If you feel really strongly about this and you want to do something, you could write to your MP, your MSP if you're in Scotland, your AM if you're in Wales, and so on, and ask them what they're doing, if they know there's temperate rainforest in the United Kingdom, and what they're going to do about it to help save this internationally important habitat. And finally, just spread the word. If you go to the rainforest, put it on your Facebook site, put it on your, tweet about it, whatever you're going to do, talk about it with your friends down the pub. Spread the word, because not many people know we have a rainforest, and it would be great if a few more did. So thank you for listening to all that. I think there have been some questions on the chat, so I'm going to welcome Dave back and Erin in to see if we can answer some of those questions for you. I think we've just got a few minutes.
Hi, apologies if I don't get to your questions. There's been a lot of very good ones, and if you want them answered afterwards, please email Plantlife. It's at the bottom of all of those web pages that I just sent you. So one that was kind of a theme throughout was about drought and how like we're in a climate that's warming and how ongoing drought issues may affect temperate rainforests in the UK.
Shall I take that one, Julie?
I
Or
think
do
that's one
want
for you,
to?
Dave.
Yeah, it's a biggie, basically. I think there has been some work done again by Dr. Chris Ellis up in Edinburgh, kind of trying to model for Scotland anyway the potential impacts of climate change, and it basically looks like the river systems are going to become increasingly important. So where you have humidity maintained by water flow and canopy, woodland canopy. So keeping our, certainly in the west, and then keeping our kind of wooded river systems and water bodies is going to be really important. I don't think it's really been that well looked into, just the kind of, and how modelled it's been, this kind of impact on more widely in Britain, this potential impact of climate change. But it's certainly a biggie that's more likely to impact further south and west, I guess, than it is in the north and west.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And then we had a couple of questions about rewilding and deer numbers. So let's start with some. Is there low density grazing? Would that be beneficial to the rainforest? And if so, is there like a humane way to limit deer numbers instead of just culling them?
I can pick up on the grazing bit. I mean, the kind of like, yeah, so I think, as I mentioned earlier, then sort of low levels of grazing and browsing are generally the best way to manage the rainforests. It's kind of replicates that probably what would have happened thousands of years ago, where you get sort of herds of wild cattle and wild horses roaming through the woods and meadows. And so there'll be kind of patchy areas of grazing, different intensities of grazing in different places. That's kind of what we're trying to replicate, but on these much more smaller micro scales with now we've put fences around everything. So yeah, low levels of grazing is generally what we were looking at. In terms of the deer issue, so it's less of a big problem in England and Wales. We have goat issues, but I might just bat the deer question over to Julie, if that's okay.
Deer question, yeah. So the question I think was about, are there more humane methods than shooting them? I haven't heard of humane methods that are being talked about in Scotland, I must admit. Culling them, I think, is regarded to be fairly humane amongst the circles that I'm working with. There are really high numbers. People often talk about whether we should be reintroducing top predators to control them. We're not ready for that in Scotland yet. There needs to be quite a long societal debate before we're ready to do that. In the meantime, what we're saying is there's a really good resource on the hill which could be beneficial economically and socially for local communities if we could only manage to get a good venison market going. It's quite difficult to buy wild venison in Scotland at the moment, but some of the work we're trying to do collaboratively through this, if we can find some funding, is to look at how we can develop good community venison larders and enable the marketing of local wild venison, which again would create jobs in quite sparsely populated areas that are in need of these sorts of job opportunities. So it's a big question, dear. There's a lot of change coming in Scotland, and it's not easy to work out how to go forward, but at least there are some, some possibilities there.
Awesome.
Sorry, I should say that just in terms of England and Wales, I meant when I said we haven't got such a deer problem, it's in the rainforest. Obviously, there are big deer issues across a lot of England.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification, Dave. So how does the principle of rewilding relate to or interact with efforts to save the rainforest? Are there overlaps? Are we encountering some conflicts?
Shall I start? Oh, you can
Yeah,
start.
go.
If I could start, I just think, it's often a question of framing. I think rewilding is interesting. And I think in England and Wales, the term rewilding is probably interpreted in different ways by different kinds of people. But I think if I think about rewilding, I think about more nature. And I often have heard people say it's about more nature, and we all want more nature. So there's a lot of common ground between everybody, or there is total common ground between everybody. But I think it's about how you frame it. So the ultimate rewilding is an ecosystem that you can just leave to itself, and it'll get on with it, and that's fine. And that's what the rewilders want. I'd say in Scotland, I can't speak for England and Wales, we're a long way from that. And I think you have to see rewilding on a scale. So we're right at the very beginning, because it will never be able to chomping its way through the choking its way through the rainforest and let the deer numbers do their own thing. You will lose the rainforest. But if we could get rid of rhododendron in a way it can't return, and we can get sustainable levels of deer back, so that the rainforest can regenerate itself again, that's rewilding essentially. But we don't frame it as rewilding because that's not helpful for the way we're talking about it in the Alliance. But you could say it's rewilding. It's the same thing. It's about more nature.
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of that as well. It's rewilding. The term seems to mean vastly different things to different people. I think the key thing for rainforest, and particularly rainforest lichens and bryophytes and ferns, will be maintaining that grazing element, however that's done. So I've always quite liked the NEP model of, to me, that's not what I would call rewilding. That's extensive management, and I could see that working in a rainforest or wooded kind of situation where you still have grazing animals, but either one way or another, if you remove grazing entirely from rainforest woods, you will, from what we've seen in past decades, you will basically start to lose your lichen and bryophyte interest that really kind of defines the habitat in the first place. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you again for that. And then I have another question. Well, this one's probably going to be really quick, and I personally just want to know the answer. How old are our rainforests here? Because tropical rainforests have many years of undisturbed development, and do we have a similar situation?
So the slides I showed of the blackberries and custard, that little site there, where the blackberries and custard grows. So I got taken there by a well-known lichenologist called Neil Sanderson, and it's on a really inaccessible little ledge on the steep side of a gorge, and this quite big stand of hazel is just kind of sitting there. And he said to me, "You're probably only the second person that's ever been on here, ever." And I sort of thought about that, and I thought, okay, yeah. And then I started looking into hazel, and so hazel's been around in North Wales for, I don't know, 6,000 years or something like that. So hazel would have been on that site potentially for 6,000 years, happily regenerating, happily doing its hazel thing. So thousands of years. It's been around. What we haven't got, I don't think, in the UK is virgin, untouched rainforest. That's what we're missing compared to, say, perhaps parts of the Pacific Northwest, except perhaps, for my little ledge of hazel, maybe that is untouched, but by and large, we don't really have those expanses of virgin stuff. So plenty of sites, I'd say, where we have some continuity of woodland cover for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So old, in my opinion.
Old. Well, thank you very much, both Julie and Dave. Our time, unfortunately, is up. I will leave my personal Zoom open since I'm the host, and if you guys need to grab any links or comments or answers throughout, please, I will just leave it and you can grab those for the next 5-ish minutes. And thank you again, both of you, for your time. It was super fascinating.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone.